Hi, dear listeners. A warm welcome to the English Globe. I'm Adam, and together with my co-host Julia, we're truly happy to have you with us today. Whether you're listening from Europe, Asia, Africa, or anywhere else in the world, thank you for choosing our podcast as your place to learn English through global stories. Our goal is simple: to help you improve your English skills while you also understand what's happening in our world right now. So sit back, relax, and let's begin this fascinating journey together.
Hello everyone, I'm Julia, and it's a pleasure to join you again for another educational episode. Today we're going to discuss a very important and historic event that has captured the world's attention. President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin are set to meet in Budapest in an ambitious attempt to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. This is a topic full of hope, diplomacy, and complexity, and it's perfect for English learners who want to study international news in clear and simple English.
We're living in a moment where global politics changes fast. Just imagine, two of the most powerful men in the world planning to sit face-to-face in Europe to talk about peace. For many people, this meeting could be a turning point in one of the biggest conflicts of our time. For English learners, it's a chance to understand new vocabulary related to diplomacy, negotiations, and world affairs. Learning English through real stories like this helps you connect language with meaning, and that makes your learning more powerful and natural.
The world has been watching the war in Ukraine for years now. It has caused enormous human suffering, economic challenges, and political divisions between countries. So when news came that President Trump, who is currently leading the United States, plans to meet President Putin in Budapest, many saw it as a bold step, a move that could either open a new door for peace or deepen the world's political debate. As learners, you will not only hear the story, but also learn how to talk about it using correct and clear English expressions.
Now, before we dive deeper into this topic, dear listeners, we kindly invite you to support our work here on the English Globe. If you're enjoying learning with us, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Your support really helps us continue creating free educational content for English learners all over the world. And remember, this is not just a podcast. It's a global classroom where everyone is welcome.
We'd also love to know more about you. Please tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Are you joining from India, Germany, Brazil, or maybe from Afghanistan or Japan? Share your country or city with us. It's wonderful to see how English brings people together from every corner of the world. And while you're writing your comment, let us know your thoughts about today's topic. Do you think this meeting between Trump and Putin could really bring peace to Ukraine? We'll be reading your opinions in the next episode.
Now let's think for a moment why this meeting is so important. For more than 3 years, the war in Ukraine has been one of the central issues in international politics. Countries have been divided on how to deal with it. The United States and many of its allies have supported Ukraine with weapons and aid, while Russia continues its military operations, claiming to defend its own interests. Against this tense background, a meeting like the one in Budapest is not just a political event. It's a test of leadership, courage, and diplomacy.
Budapest, the capital of Hungary, has often served as a bridge between East and West. Choosing it as the place for this potential summit shows how much the world needs dialogue right now. It's also a reminder that even when nations disagree, communication is still the most powerful tool for peace. This is one of the lessons we want you to remember as English learners. Language itself is a bridge. When you learn to communicate clearly, you learn to connect with people across cultures, just as leaders must do in global politics.
In this episode, we'll look closely at how this planned meeting came about, what each side hopes to achieve, and what obstacles might stand in the way. But we'll also keep our focus on language learning. Each section of this podcast will help you discover useful vocabulary and expressions that can make your English stronger. Words like negotiation, agreement, diplomacy, summit, and ceasefire will all appear as we explore the story. So keep listening carefully, and maybe take a notebook to write down any new words you hear.
And remember, our goal is not to take sides or judge political leaders. Our podcast is about understanding the world through English, not about promoting any political view. This is important for educational content. We want every listener to feel comfortable and respected, no matter where they come from or what they believe. We'll talk about facts that are publicly reported, explain their meaning in simple English, and help you practice comprehension and critical thinking, two skills that are very useful for language learners.
Sometimes when people hear about world leaders meeting to discuss war and peace, they think it's only about politics. But for English learners, it's also a window into how powerful language can be. Think of how words like peace, agreement, or negotiation shape our world. They remind us that communication, whether between nations or between friends, always begins with dialogue. And that's exactly what we're doing here today, learning how to express big ideas in clear, calm, and meaningful English.
So, dear listeners, stay tuned as we journey through the story of how the leaders of the United States and Russia are preparing for this bold diplomatic step. You'll not only understand the news better, but also expand your vocabulary, improve your pronunciation, and learn how to discuss global events with confidence. Every sentence you listen to and every word you learn brings you closer to fluency. And who knows? Maybe one day, you'll use your English skills to build peace in your own community or workplace.
Thank you once again for joining the English Globe. We're so excited to share this discussion with you today. If you haven't done it yet, please hit that subscribe button and give this episode a thumbs up. It helps the podcast reach more learners like you. After all, English is not just a language. It's a key that opens the door to the entire world. Let's open that door together and begin our exploration of the Trump-Putin Budapest meeting, a story that could shape the future of global peace and diplomacy.
Before we talk about the upcoming meeting between President Trump and President Putin in Budapest, dear listeners, it's important to understand the background of the war in Ukraine. Knowing the history helps us see why this conflict became one of the most difficult and dangerous in modern times. The story began in early 2022, when tensions that had been building for years finally exploded into a full-scale war. Russia sent its troops across Ukraine's borders, and the world watched as cities, homes, and lives were destroyed.
The roots of this conflict go back even further. For many years, Ukraine has been divided between its desire to build closer ties with Western countries, such as the United States and the European Union, and its long-standing cultural and economic links with Russia. When Ukraine expressed its wish to join NATO and the European Union, Moscow saw this as a serious threat to its influence. This disagreement, mixed with old historical wounds, created the conditions that led to war. Understanding this background helps us make sense of why peace has been so hard to achieve.
When the war began, millions of Ukrainians fled their homes in search of safety. Many crossed into Poland, Germany, and other European countries, creating one of the largest refugee crises in recent history. At the same time, many nations imposed heavy sanctions on Russia. These are economic punishments meant to pressure a country to change its behavior. You'll often hear this word in news English, sanction. It's an important term that means an official restriction used as a form of pressure in diplomacy or politics.
The United States quickly became one of Ukraine's main supporters, providing weapons, financial aid, and training. Under President Trump's current administration, America's position has focused more on finding a possible path to peace while still supporting Ukraine's right to defend itself. This balance is delicate, helping an ally while also searching for a diplomatic solution. Many world leaders see this as a difficult test of leadership and negotiation skills. It's also a reminder that sometimes words, not weapons, can shape the future.
Europe's response has been both united and divided at the same time. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states have taken a strong stance against Russia, warning about its actions. Others, like Hungary, have tried to keep closer communication with Moscow, believing that dialogue is still the best path forward. This is one reason Budapest was chosen for the possible summit. Hungary's Prime Minister has kept open channels with both Washington and Moscow, making his capital a symbolic meeting ground between East and West.
For English learners, this is a good chance to understand vocabulary related to diplomacy and conflict. Words like ceasefire, negotiation, agreement, territorial dispute, and peace talks are commonly used in international discussions. A ceasefire means a temporary stop to fighting, usually while the sides talk about peace. Negotiation means a conversation aimed at reaching an agreement. These are the same tools that diplomats and leaders use, tools that depend entirely on communication and language, just like you use in your English learning journey.
Another important concept is geopolitics. It refers to how geography, location, and power influence international relationships. For example, Ukraine's location between Russia and Europe gives it huge strategic importance. Whoever influences Ukraine can affect trade, energy routes, and security in all of Europe. That's why the world cares so deeply about this war. It's not just about land, it's about balance and security across continents. As English learners, understanding these words helps you read and discuss global news with confidence.
Now, let's think about why this conflict has continued for so long. The main reason is that both sides have goals they are not willing to give up easily. Russia says it wants to protect its people and prevent NATO expansion near its borders. Ukraine says it is defending its freedom, independence, and right to choose its future. These two goals are in direct conflict. As a result, each time peace talks have been tried, they have collapsed because neither side was ready to make major compromises.
The war has affected not only Ukraine and Russia, but also the entire world. Food prices have increased because Ukraine is one of the largest exporters of wheat and corn. Energy prices have risen because of sanctions on Russian oil and gas. These economic effects show how connected our world is today. A war in one part of the world can cause problems in another. This is what we call global interdependence. It means that countries depend on each other for trade, resources, and stability.
For the United States, the situation in Ukraine has become one of the main challenges of foreign policy. President Trump has said publicly that his goal is to bring peace to the region and to stop the human suffering that has continued for years. While critics question how realistic that goal is, supporters believe that direct dialogue with Putin could be the key to ending the fighting. Whether or not that happens, this meeting is already being seen as one of the most important diplomatic efforts of the decade.
Let's also remember that diplomacy takes time. In history, many wars ended not through sudden victories, but through long and careful negotiations. The leaders had to find common ground, a place where both sides could agree to stop fighting and start rebuilding trust. This meeting in Budapest, if it happens, could be the beginning of such a process. It's a reminder that even in dark times, there is always a possibility for peace if people are willing to talk and listen.
For English learners, this kind of real-world topic is an excellent way to improve listening and comprehension skills. When you listen to news stories, focus on how journalists describe situations. Notice their tone, word choice, and sentence structure. Try repeating new phrases out loud like to broker peace, to hold a summit, or to issue a statement. These are all common expressions in diplomatic English, and mastering them will make your language sound more natural and professional.
The war in Ukraine has taught the world many lessons. It showed how fragile peace can be, how quickly misunderstandings can grow into global crises, and how important communication is between nations. In many ways, language is the foundation of peace. Without communication, people cannot solve problems or understand each other's perspectives. That's why learning English, the language of global communication, can empower you to follow the news, join conversations, and think critically about world events.
So, as we continue this podcast, Try to think not only about what's happening in politics, but also about what it means for you as a learner. Every world event is also a learning opportunity. You can read about it, listen to it, and use it to expand your vocabulary. The story of Ukraine and Russia is difficult and emotional, but studying it helps you grow as a global citizen. Remember, education is the first step toward understanding, and understanding is the first step toward peace.
In our next part, we'll move from the background to the main figures themselves, President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin. We'll talk about their histories, their goals, and how their personalities might shape the meeting in Budapest. We'll also explore more useful English words and phrases that appear in political discussions. But for now, keep reflecting on what we discussed. How does war affect the world? And how can communication, in any language, help create peace? Those are powerful questions to think about.
Now that we've explored the background of the war in Ukraine, dear listeners, it's time to focus on the main figures in this story, the two leaders whose decisions could shape not only the future of Eastern Europe, but also the direction of global peace. We're talking about President Donald Trump of the United States and President Vladimir Putin of Russia. These two men have dominated world headlines for years, both known for their strong personalities, their confidence, and their very different visions of how the world should work.
Let's start with President Donald Trump, who is currently serving his second term as the leader of the United States. Trump is one of the most unique and controversial political figures in modern history. Before entering politics, he was a businessman and television personality, known for his bold style and direct communication. His supporters see him as a strong leader who speaks his mind and puts America's interests first. His critics, on the other hand, believe his methods are unconventional and sometimes unpredictable. But no matter how people feel about him, his influence on global politics is undeniable.
President Trump's approach to international relations has always been centered on negotiation and personal diplomacy. He believes that strong leaders can solve big problems by sitting down together and speaking directly. That belief seems to be behind his decision to meet with Vladimir Putin in Budapest. Trump has said publicly that the world needs peace more than ever, and that he is ready to end endless wars. This phrase, "end endless wars," has become a powerful slogan, showing his desire to reduce conflict and focus on rebuilding global stability.
Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, is another figure who has shaped the world's political landscape for more than 2 decades. A former intelligence officer, he first came to power in the early 2000s and has remained the central figure in Russian politics ever since. Known for his calm but firm personality, Putin has worked to restore Russia's influence on the global stage. To his supporters, he represents strength, national pride, and resistance against Western pressure. To his critics, he represents authoritarian control and aggression. Either way, his leadership style has left a deep mark on history.
When these two leaders meet, the world always pays attention. Their relationship has been complex, a mixture of competition and communication. In the past, both men have said that they respect each other's strength as leaders, but they also represent countries with very different goals. The United States stands for democratic alliances, freedom of speech, and the rule of law, while Russia emphasizes sovereignty, national identity, and its traditional values. When these two visions meet, diplomacy becomes both a challenge and an opportunity.
It's important to remember that behind every global meeting, there are also many advisors, diplomats, and negotiators working day and night. In the upcoming Budapest meeting, we expect to see not just Trump and Putin, but also their foreign ministers, security advisors, and interpreters. These are the people who help shape every word, phrase, and gesture. In diplomacy, every small detail, from the seating arrangement to the color of the flag, carries symbolic meaning. That's why preparation for such a summit can take weeks or even months.
Let's talk about some of the key vocabulary that you, as English learners, can pick up from this part of the story. The word summit means a high-level meeting between leaders of different countries. You might also hear the term bilateral meeting, which means a meeting between two nations. Another useful term is diplomatic channel. It refers to official communication between governments. And foreign policy means the way a country manages its relationships with other countries. These terms are essential if you want to discuss international affairs in English.
Another interesting word is mediator. A mediator is a person who helps two sides in a conflict find a peaceful solution. Sometimes a third country, like Hungary in this case, can play the role of a mediator by providing a neutral place for talks. The idea of neutral ground is also common in diplomacy. It means a location that both sides can accept without feeling threatened or judged. That's one reason why Budapest was chosen as the venue for this potential meeting. Hungary is a member of the European Union, but maintains communication with both the West and Russia.
President Trump's plan for the meeting has drawn mixed reactions. Some political analysts say it's a bold move that could lead to progress, while others believe it might be too optimistic. However, Trump's supporters argue that his strength lies in his confidence and ability to negotiate directly. They say that his unconventional style, using simple and clear language, often helps to break barriers that traditional diplomacy struggles with. Whether or not this meeting will bring peace, it already shows how much words and personality can shape world events.
On the Russian side, President Putin sees this meeting as a chance to show that Russia still has a strong voice in global affairs. Despite facing international sanctions and criticism, he continues to present himself as a defender of his country's interests. His speeches often use language like sovereignty, security, and respect. These words reflect his belief that every nation has the right to make its own decisions without outside interference. Understanding such vocabulary helps you grasp the deeper meaning behind political statements.
Now, let's not forget the other key players who might influence this meeting. One of them is Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. While he may not be present in Budapest, his position is central to the entire discussion. Ukraine has made it clear that any peace plan must respect its territorial integrity. That means keeping its borders safe and unchanged. The involvement of European leaders, especially from NATO and the EU, will also shape the outcome. Their main concern is ensuring stability and preventing further escalation in the region.
In addition to politicians, there are also diplomats, translators, and security experts preparing for such a summit. Translators play a very important role, as every sentence must be interpreted carefully to avoid misunderstandings. Imagine the pressure of translating between two presidents whose every word can influence world peace. This is why diplomacy is sometimes called the art of careful communication. For English learners, it's a great example of how powerful accurate language can be. A single word can make or break an agreement.
It's also worth mentioning the media. Global news outlets will follow every moment of the meeting. Cameras, journalists, and analysts will report every handshake, every statement, and every smile. In diplomatic language, body language can be just as important as spoken words. A simple gesture of respect, like shaking hands or maintaining eye contact, can send strong signals of goodwill. This teaches us that communication is not only about words, it's about tone, gesture, and expression, skills that all language learners should develop.
When we look at these key figures, Trump, Putin, Zelensky, and others, we see how leadership style affects diplomacy. Some leaders prefer open confrontation, while others prefer quiet negotiation. Trump's style is direct and bold. Putin's is calm and strategic. Both men believe in strength, but they express it in different ways. Understanding these differences helps us appreciate how complex world politics really is. It also shows that behind every global issue, there are human personalities, emotions, and ambitions.
So, dear listeners, as we explore this story together, try to think like an English learner and like a global citizen. Listen to how leaders speak, study their vocabulary, and pay attention to the tone they use. Ask yourself, what message are they trying to send? What kind of words do they choose to show power or peace? This kind of analysis will not only help you improve your English, but also help you think critically about the information you read or hear in the news.
The upcoming meeting in Budapest is more than just a political event. It's a test of communication, patience, and global responsibility. Both President Trump and President Putin know that the world will be watching. Every word they say could bring nations closer to peace or push them further apart. That's why language, the very tool we are all learning, is at the heart of diplomacy. It's the bridge that connects ideas, builds trust, and shapes history.
In the next part of our podcast, we'll talk about the Budapest venue itself, why this city was chosen, what it symbolizes, and how its location might affect the atmosphere of the meeting. We'll also discuss how Hungary's position between East and West makes it an interesting host for such a high-stakes event. But for now, take a moment to think about what you've learned in this section. Politics, diplomacy, and language are deeply connected, and when used wisely, they can bring the world one step closer to peace.
Budapest, the capital of Hungary, might seem like an unusual choice at first glance, but when we look closer, it makes perfect sense. Hungary has long tried to position itself as a bridge between East and West, between Europe and Russia, between NATO and neutral diplomacy. It's not a global power, but it's a country that understands both sides. Hosting a meeting between President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin gives Budapest a symbolic identity as what diplomats sometimes call ground zero for dialogue. It's a place where conversation, not confrontation, can begin.
That's an interesting way to put it, Julia. Ground zero for dialogue. Usually, when we hear the phrase ground zero, we think of the starting point of something significant, sometimes even something destructive. But here, the meaning is flipped. Budapest could be the starting point for reconstruction, for rebuilding trust, and for restoring communication between two world powers. It's like starting from zero, but with the hope of reaching a positive result.
Exactly, Adam. And this idea of neutral ground is deeply important. Hungary is a member of the European Union and NATO, but its leadership has maintained relatively closer relations with Russia than most European countries. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has often presented Hungary as an independent thinker in foreign affairs, someone who can talk to both Washington and Moscow. This makes Budapest what we call a neutral venue, a place where both leaders can feel comfortable enough to talk without too much political pressure from the host nation.
That's right, Julia. In diplomatic terms, a neutral venue is not just about geography. It's about psychology. It means both sides can walk into the room without feeling like they are on the opponent's turf. For example, if the meeting were held in Washington or Moscow, it would create an imbalance of power. One leader would feel at home, while the other would feel like a guest. In Budapest, neither Trump nor Putin can claim home advantage, which helps create a more balanced atmosphere for open talks.
And beyond symbolism, there are also practical reasons behind choosing Budapest. Travel logistics and international legal issues play a big role. Since an international arrest warrant still exists for President Putin issued by the International Criminal Court, many Western countries are off-limits for him. However, Hungary has made it clear that it doesn't plan to enforce that warrant. That means Budapest provides a safe and politically manageable space for both sides to meet without diplomatic embarrassment.
That's a very important detail, Julia. The choice of venue isn't just about scenery or comfort. It's about legality, safety, and strategy. For the United States, Budapest is close enough to the heart of Europe to show commitment to peace, but also distant enough from direct conflict zones to prevent unnecessary provocation. It also allows European observers and mediators to be nearby if talks progress into formal negotiations later on.
Yes, and Hungary's history adds another layer of meaning. This country has seen empires rise and fall. It was once part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then influenced by the Soviet Union, and now it's part of the European Union. That history gives it a deep understanding of both Western and Eastern mindsets. It's almost poetic that such a historically divided yet connected city would become the meeting point for two leaders trying to end a modern war.
It's also interesting to think of Budapest as what you might call a diplomatic theater. Every global summit is a kind of stage performance, where leaders are not only negotiating, they're also performing for the world. Cameras will follow every handshake, every smile, every facial expression. The setting, the flags, the background music, even the room's lighting, all these details contribute to what we call diplomatic symbolism. It's more than politics. It's international storytelling through images and gestures.
That's a great expression, Adam. Diplomatic theatre. And in this theatre, Budapest becomes the stage, the place where narratives of peace and power are acted out. Both Trump and Putin know how to use visual diplomacy effectively. Trump understands media optics better than almost any modern leader, while Putin values strong imagery that shows control and confidence. Their meeting in a neutral European capital allows both of them to project authority and cooperation at the same time.
It's also worth noting that timing matters just as much as location. The world is currently facing growing fatigue from the ongoing war in Ukraine. Energy prices, economic uncertainty, and humanitarian issues have left many countries eager for a resolution. Choosing Budapest now sends a message that diplomacy is not dead, that dialogue is still possible even after years of hostility. The city becomes not only a geographical point, but a symbol of global timing, an attempt to restart peace when the world most needs it.
And that's why this meeting has captured so much attention, Adam. It's not just another political visit. It represents the hope that conversation can replace confrontation, and that compromise might one day replace conflict. For our English learners listening today, this is also a chance to learn vocabulary connected to diplomacy and international relations. Phrases like neutral venue, ground zero, and diplomatic theatre are not just words. They describe how leaders think and act on the world stage.
Yes, and it's fascinating how language reflects the complexity of world politics. Even a simple phrase like meet halfway can have a deep political meaning. It reminds us that diplomacy often happens not in extremes, but in the middle, in cities like Budapest, where East meets West. Whether this meeting succeeds or fails, the choice of Hungary as the venue already tells us something important, that there's still a willingness to talk, to listen, and to search for peace through dialogue.
Beautifully said, Adam. The world doesn't need more division. It needs platforms where conversations can happen. And right now, Budapest is that platform. It's where history might take a new turn, not through weapons or threats, but through words, handshakes, and understanding. For language learners, this is a moment to watch and learn how leaders communicate, because in diplomacy, every word has power.
Absolutely, Julia. Whether this becomes a breakthrough or just another diplomatic chapter remains to be seen, but one thing is certain. Budapest has placed itself at the very center of a historic attempt at peace. And that, in itself, is a story worth telling, and a lesson worth learning. Now, Julia, we've talked about where this meeting is happening and why it matters, but the real question is, what do both sides actually hope to achieve in Budapest? Many observers believe the primary goal is simple but incredibly difficult: a ceasefire. For our listeners, a ceasefire means a temporary or permanent stop to fighting. It doesn't mean peace has been achieved, but it's the first and most essential step toward it. If President Trump and President Putin can even agree on a limited ceasefire, that would already mark a significant diplomatic breakthrough.
Exactly, Adam. A ceasefire is like pressing the pause button in a conflict. It gives both sides a chance to breathe, to assess the situation, and to open the door for deeper talks. But beyond just stopping the fighting, there's another term we often hear: the front line. The front line refers to the border or area where two opposing forces meet in battle. In Ukraine, these front lines have shifted many times over the years, causing cities and towns to change control repeatedly. The Budapest meeting could aim to freeze these front lines, meaning both sides agree to stop moving forward or backward militarily while diplomacy continues.
Yes, and freezing the front line could be seen as the first practical goal. It doesn't solve the conflict, but it prevents further escalation. However, that leads us to one of the most sensitive topics: territorial concessions. In simple words, a territorial concession means that one side agrees to give up control over some land in order to secure peace. This idea is incredibly controversial, Julia, because for Ukraine, giving up any territory feels like losing sovereignty, and for Russia, stepping back from captured areas feels like admitting defeat.
That's the heart of the difficulty, Adam. Territorial questions are emotional and political. For the people living in those regions, it's not just about borders. It's about identity, language, culture, and safety. Any decision that changes territorial control affects millions of lives, and neither side is ready to compromise easily. Ukraine wants to restore all its territory, while Russia wants recognition of the areas it currently controls. The Budapest meeting might therefore focus on smaller, temporary agreements, rather than full-scale territorial deals.
That's right. Diplomacy often works step by step. Instead of aiming for one big peace treaty, negotiators might discuss smaller measures, like humanitarian aid, prisoner exchanges, or reopening transport routes. Behind these talks, there's also something called a non-paper. For our English learners, a non-paper is an informal document shared between diplomats that lists possible solutions or ideas without making them official. It's a way to test reactions quietly before making public statements. These non-papers can be the backbone of progress because they allow flexibility and privacy in discussion.
Yes, and that's where the negotiating table comes in, both literally and symbolically. The phrase, "to bring someone to the negotiating table," means convincing different sides to sit down and talk. It's one of the hardest parts of any conflict. Both sides need to feel that they are not being forced, but rather invited to cooperate. The Budapest meeting could be that table, a moment when both leaders test how much space there is for compromise without appearing weak to their own nations.
Exactly, Julia. Because even though peace sounds like a universal goal, the politics behind it are complex. President Trump might want to present himself as a global peacemaker, but he also has to think about how his domestic audience, especially American voters, will view any deal. Similarly, President Putin has to maintain his image of strength and control. Neither leader wants to appear as if they are giving in. That's why we can say this meeting is more about diplomatic choreography than immediate solutions. Every move must be carefully balanced.
That's such a good point, Adam. For our listeners learning English, this is a perfect example of how diplomacy uses language to shape outcomes. Words like pause, freeze, and temporary arrangement are often used instead of retreat or withdraw. The choice of words can make or break an agreement. Even the word compromise can have different shades of meaning. In everyday life, it means finding a middle ground. But in international politics, it can sound like weakness if not presented carefully.
True, Julia. And that's why many peace talks end up being about language before they're about borders. The Budapest meeting will likely involve teams of diplomats drafting different versions of possible agreements, changing small phrases again and again to make them acceptable to both sides. Sometimes, a single word can delay peace for weeks or months. That's how precise and delicate international negotiation is.
And even if a ceasefire or partial agreement is reached, keeping it alive is another challenge. Many past conflicts have seen ceasefires broken because of mistrust or lack of clear verification. That's why observers and peace monitors are often used to make sure both sides follow through. It's not just about signing a paper, it's about building confidence day by day. In that sense, this meeting isn't the end of the road. It's just the beginning of a very long diplomatic journey.
Exactly, Julia. To sum it up for our listeners, this meeting in Budapest could aim to stop the fighting temporarily, freeze current positions, and open the door to long-term peace talks. But both leaders have limits on what they can agree to. Ukraine's sovereignty, Russia's pride, and global political pressures all make the path to compromise extremely difficult. Still, every peace begins with a conversation, and this meeting might be that first essential conversation that the world has been waiting for.
Beautifully said, Adam. And for our English learners, remember these important words from today's discussion: ceasefire, front line, territorial concession, non-paper, and negotiating table. Each of them represents a piece of the diplomatic puzzle. Understanding their meanings helps us see how international relations work in real life, not just through power, but through dialogue, patience, and communication. Whether or not Budapest brings peace, it reminds us of one universal truth. Every great change begins when people decide to sit down and talk. Adam, as much as this meeting in Budapest sounds promising, we also need to be realistic. There are serious obstacles standing in the way of real progress. On one side, Russia has made clear demands, including international recognition of the territories it now controls in eastern and southern Ukraine. Moscow views these regions as part of its federation, but for most of the world, and especially for Kyiv, these areas are still legally Ukrainian. Recognizing them as Russian would mean accepting the result of military action, which Ukraine and its allies cannot agree to. This is one of the biggest reasons why peace efforts have repeatedly stalled.
That's right, Julia. And on the other side, Ukraine has been equally firm. For President Zelensky and his government, giving up any land would feel like a betrayal to the soldiers and civilians who have sacrificed so much defending it. Ukraine insists that any peace must be based on full territorial integrity, meaning all areas, including Crimea, should be restored. That's a huge gap between the two positions. It shows that, before even sitting at the negotiating table, both sides already have strong preconditions. In diplomacy, preconditions are demands that must be accepted before talks can even begin. And when both sides have non-negotiable preconditions, the talks often stall before they start.
Exactly, and that's why even organizing a meeting like this one in Budapest is such a delicate process. There are not only political, but also legal and travel complications. President Putin faces an active arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court, which limits where he can safely travel. Even though Hungary has indicated that it would not enforce that warrant, it still creates tension among other European nations. Some countries see his participation as controversial, while others view it as necessary for peace. These competing perspectives make diplomacy slow and difficult.
Yes, and that brings us to another important diplomatic phrase: leverage. In international relations, leverage means the power or influence one side has over another to get a better deal. Both Russia and Ukraine are trying to maintain leverage. Russia uses control of territory and energy exports as leverage, while Ukraine uses international support and public sympathy. The United States and Europe also have their own leverage, mainly through sanctions and economic aid. So, every decision in the Budapest talks will depend on how much leverage each side is willing to give up or trade in exchange for peace.
That's such an important point, Adam. And when diplomacy gets stuck like this, we say that negotiations have stalled. A stalled negotiation doesn't mean it's over. It means progress has slowed or stopped, often because neither side wants to appear weak by making the first concession. This happens all the time in politics. Each leader waits for the other to blink first. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, diplomats continue to talk quietly, preparing documents and testing new ideas in what they call back-channel diplomacy.
Exactly. But sometimes, if talks go badly, one side might decide to walk away from the table. This expression means to end discussions, either temporarily or permanently, because no progress is being made. It's often used as a negotiation tactic to create pressure. For example, a country might threaten to walk away just to make the other side feel urgency or fear of losing the opportunity. It's a form of diplomatic theater, where even silence or absence becomes a message.
Yes, Adam. And that's where communication strategy plays a huge role. When negotiations stall, leaders turn to public rhetoric, speeches, interviews, and media appearances to shape how people perceive the talks. For instance, both Trump and Putin understand the importance of controlling the story. If progress is slow, they can still use positive language like constructive discussions or productive atmosphere to make it seem like things are moving forward, even when they aren't. This is one of the rhetorical tools leaders use to influence public opinion.
That's right. In diplomacy, how something sounds can sometimes matter more than what actually happens. Leaders use words strategically to keep hope alive or to protect their image. For example, saying, "We had honest and open talks," sounds positive, even if the meeting ended without results. It signals that dialogue continues and that both sides are behaving responsibly. For our English learners, this is a great example of how language can soften reality, a key skill in diplomatic communication.
And sometimes when there's no agreement, leaders release what's called a joint statement, even if it contains very general language, like both sides agreed to continue dialogue. It helps maintain a sense of progress. This is why diplomacy is often described as the art of the possible. It's not about getting everything you want, but about keeping doors open, even when they're only slightly ajar.
Exactly, Julia. But keeping that door open can be exhausting. Negotiations like these demand patience, strategy, and emotional intelligence. Each side is constantly weighing what it can lose versus what it can gain. For Trump, the challenge is balancing peace efforts with political expectations at home. For Putin, it's maintaining authority while facing international pressure. And for Ukraine, it's ensuring that any compromise does not erase years of sacrifice. That's a complex mix of goals, fears, and limits.
It really is. And the longer diplomacy remains stalled, the more complicated the situation becomes. Every month that passes without progress means more suffering, more mistrust, and fewer options for compromise. That's why the Budapest meeting, even with all its difficulties, is still so important. It's a chance to reintroduce movement, to turn a stalled process back into a working negotiation.
Well said, Julia. For our listeners learning English, today's section introduced some very useful diplomatic expressions: to walk away from the table, preconditions, leverage, stalled negotiations, and rhetorical tools. These phrases don't just belong to politics, they also describe how communication and persuasion work in real life. Whether in business, leadership, or daily conversation, the ability to keep dialogue alive, even when it's hard, is one of the most valuable skills you can learn.
Exactly, Adam. And in the world of diplomacy, language is both the weapon and the bridge. The Budapest talks face many obstacles, but as long as leaders keep talking, and as long as they choose their words with care, there remains a small but meaningful chance for peace.
Julia, when we talk about the Trump-Putin meeting in Budapest, it's impossible to ignore the reactions coming from Europe and NATO. For European nations, this meeting is both a source of cautious hope and deep concern. Many European leaders are hoping that diplomacy can finally ease tensions in their region, especially since the Ukraine war has created major security, economic, and humanitarian challenges. but at the same time, they fear that any deal made without their direct involvement might weaken the unity that NATO has worked so hard to maintain since the conflict began. For Europe, it's not just about peace. It's about ensuring that peace doesn't come at the cost of allied solidarity.
That's an important phrase, Adam. Allied solidarity. For our English learners, this means the unity and shared purpose among countries that belong to the same alliance, like NATO. When NATO members say they act in solidarity, it means they support one another politically, militarily, and diplomatically. This unity has been one of the most powerful messages since the war began. European nations have stood together in imposing sanctions, providing military aid, and defending the principle that borders cannot be changed by force. So, when leaders hear that Trump and Putin will meet privately in Budapest, some of them worry it might weaken that message of togetherness.
Exactly, Julia. And within NATO, there are different layers of concern. Some member states, especially those close to Russia like Poland, the Baltic countries, and Romania, are worried about what they call side deals or quiet compromises that could affect their own security. These countries have been among Ukraine's strongest supporters, and they want to make sure that any ceasefire or negotiation includes strong security guarantees. For our listeners, that term, security guarantee, means a formal promise that a country's safety will be protected by others, usually through defense alliances or treaties.
Right, and for nations like Poland, that concept of security guarantee is not just theoretical. It's essential. They live next door to a conflict zone and have seen the consequences of instability before. Recently, Polish officials even made a strong statement warning that President Putin's aircraft would not be allowed to cross Polish airspace on the way to Budapest. That brings us to another useful term for our listeners: airspace sovereignty. It refers to a country's right to control and protect the sky above its territory. It's the same as having borders on the ground, but this time in the air. Poland's message was clear. Even peace efforts must respect national sovereignty.
That's a perfect example, Julia. Poland's warning shows that even as Europe hopes for peace, it's still highly cautious about how that peace might be pursued. Some countries see the meeting as a chance to reduce global tension, while others worry it could shift the balance of power in ways that leave smaller nations more vulnerable. NATO officials have also expressed mixed emotions. On one hand, they welcome any effort that could stop the fighting in Ukraine. On the other, they don't want to see negotiations that weaken the alliance's collective defense principles or reduce Europe's ability to act together.
Exactly. And for many European governments, this meeting is also a test of trust. Over the past years, NATO has shown unity through actions, joint exercises, increased troop presence on the eastern flank, and coordinated policies. But unity is fragile when big powers start talking independently. Some analysts in Brussels have even suggested that Trump's approach to diplomacy might unsettle allies who prefer multilateral discussions, meaning talks that include all partners instead of just two main players. That's why there's both curiosity and nervousness about what might happen in Budapest.
That's very true, Julia. Another layer to this is the economic side of Europe's reaction. The war has already caused major disruptions to energy supplies, trade routes, and industrial production. European economies have been heavily affected by the rise in fuel costs and the refugee crisis. For some nations, especially Germany and France, a diplomatic breakthrough could relieve economic pressure. But for others, like the Baltic states or Poland, peace at the cost of Ukraine's independence would be unacceptable. So, Europe is trying to balance hope for peace with the need to defend moral and strategic principles.
It's a very fine line, Adam. And it shows that diplomacy doesn't only happen between two leaders. It has ripple effects across entire regions. Every statement made by Trump or Putin in Budapest will be analysed in European capitals, in Berlin, Warsaw, Paris, and London, to see what it means for the continent's stability. NATO itself has emphasized that any peace deal should reflect Ukraine's sovereignty and follow international law. That's why the alliance keeps reminding members to coordinate positions before and after such high-profile meetings.
And for our listeners learning English, this situation is full of valuable vocabulary and lessons in global communication. We've mentioned allied solidarity, security guarantee, and airspace sovereignty, all important terms that describe how countries manage relationships within large organizations like NATO. It's also a reminder that language in diplomacy is carefully chosen to express both power and partnership. When NATO says we stand united, that's not just a slogan. It's a strategic message to reassure allies and deter adversaries.
That's a great observation, Adam. And one more thing worth highlighting is how the media in Europe is covering this story. Different countries are focusing on different aspects. Some celebrate Trump's initiative to reopen dialogue, while others warn that Russia could use the meeting to divide Western allies. The diversity of opinions shows that Europe is not a single voice, but a chorus of nations with different histories, geographies, and security needs. Yet, despite those differences, the concept of allied solidarity remains the glue that holds NATO together.
Beautifully said, Julia. And in many ways, that's what makes this moment so significant. The Budapest meeting isn't only about ending one war, it's about testing how strong the world's alliances are. It's about whether the ideals of unity and shared responsibility can survive under pressure. For NATO and Europe, the coming days will be a test not just of diplomacy, but of endurance, trust, and cooperation.
Exactly, Adam. And for our English learners around the world, understanding these words and ideas helps you follow international news more closely. Terms like allied solidarity, security guarantee, and airspace sovereignty show how language reflects global relationships. Behind every political headline, there's vocabulary that shapes how the world talks about peace, power, and partnership. The reactions from Europe and NATO remind us that diplomacy is not just about two leaders. It's about an entire network of nations learning how to act as one. Adam, before we wrap up the main discussion, I want to dedicate this section to something very special for our English learners. Throughout today's podcast, we've used many expressions and phrases that are common in international diplomacy. Understanding them can help you not only follow global news, but also improve your speaking and listening skills. Let's start with one very important term: frozen conflict. Adam, would you like to explain what that means?
Of course, Julia. A frozen conflict is a situation where fighting has stopped or significantly reduced, but no formal peace treaty has been signed. Essentially, the war is on pause, not fully resolved. The fighting may have decreased, but tensions remain, and there's always a risk that hostilities could restart. For example, some parts of Ukraine or other regions in the world experience frozen conflicts for years, with occasional skirmishes or political pressure. For learners, you might practice saying, "The ceasefire turned the war into a frozen conflict." Try repeating that slowly.
Great, Adam. Another phrase that comes up often is diplomatic breakthrough. This is used when talks succeed in making significant progress. It doesn't mean everything is solved, but it's a moment where negotiation achieves something important. For instance, if Trump and Putin agree to a temporary ceasefire, that could be called a diplomatic breakthrough. Adam, can you give an example?
Absolutely. Julia, I'll try. The idea of holding joint exercises is on the table. Julia. Good. And I could say, the proposal to increase trade tariffs is now on the table. Listeners, repeat both sentences and try to make your own. Think about what ideas or options in your life are on the table.
Now let's look at give and take. This is a classic phrase in negotiations, meaning compromise or mutual adjustment. Diplomacy is always about give and take. No side gets everything it wants. You could say, the leaders agreed to a give and take approach during the talks. Adam, Would you like to try a short dialogue using this phrase?
Sure, Julia. Here's an example. Person A. It seems the talks are slow. Person B. Yes, but diplomacy always requires some give and take. Person A. True, maybe both sides will make concessions soon. Listeners, repeat after me and notice how the phrase fits naturally into conversation.
Finally, let's introduce a slightly more advanced expression. Walk back on statements. This is used when a leader or negotiator retracts or softens something they previously said. For example, after criticism from allies, the president walked back on statements about territorial concessions. Adam, can you give a short dialogue for this one too?
Of course. Here's a sample. Person A. Did the minister really threaten sanctions? Person B. Yes, but he walked back on statements after the meeting. Person A. So it wasn't as strong as it first sounded. Listeners, repeat slowly and think of situations in your own life where someone might walk back on statements.
Now, Adam, let's include a few quick quizzes and prompts for our learners. First question. What does it mean to broker peace? Listeners, try to answer aloud before we continue. Yes, to broker peace means to help negotiate an agreement between two sides in conflict. For example, the UN tried to broker peace between the countries.
Second prompt. Can you use leverage in a sentence about diplomacy? Remember, leverage means power or influence to gain an advantage. One example could be, Ukraine uses international support as leverage to strengthen its position at the negotiating table. Now, pause and try making your own sentence using leverage.
Another one. Use frozen conflict in a sentence. Think carefully. Here's an example. The region has been a frozen conflict for years, with no peace treaty signed. Try saying it aloud.
Listeners, let's do one last short dialogue together, using multiple phrases we learned today. Person A. Do you think the ceasefire will succeed? Person B. It's too early to say. The proposals are still on the table, and it will require a lot of give and take. Person A. I hope it leads to a diplomatic breakthrough soon. Julia. Exactly. Repeat this dialogue aloud and practice pronunciation and intonation. This is a perfect way to make your English sound natural, even when talking about complex topics like diplomacy.
To sum up, today we practiced frozen conflict, diplomatic breakthrough, on the table, give and take, and walk back on statements. We also tried using broker peace and leverage. Adam, these expressions are not just political. They are versatile for real-life conversations too.
Absolutely, Julia. For our learners, the key is to listen, repeat, and use these phrases in context. The world of diplomacy teaches us about careful word choice, compromise, and timing, and practicing these expressions can make your English sound more fluent, precise, and confident. Remember, every phrase has a story behind it, and every story is a chance to learn. Julia, as we reach the final section of today's podcast, it's time to consider what could happen as a result of the Budapest meeting between President Trump and President Putin. While nobody can predict the future, we can outline some possible scenarios. The first is a successful meeting, meaning both leaders reach a significant agreement, perhaps a ceasefire or a plan to freeze the front lines. This would be a major step toward peace and could show that dialogue, patience, and compromise are effective tools in resolving conflicts.
Yes, Adam. And for our English learners, it's important to understand these scenarios in simple language. A successful meeting means that both leaders agree on something important, and the world sees a positive result. Even a small agreement can prevent further fighting, help people affected by war, and make other countries feel safer. For learners, you can think of it like solving a difficult problem with friends. Even a partial solution is better than no solution.
Another scenario is a stall. In this case, the meeting may produce no major decisions and negotiations remain slow. Neither side makes real concessions, but the dialogue continues. This is common in diplomacy, where trust is low and leaders are cautious. A stall doesn't mean failure. It simply means progress takes longer and more effort is needed to reach an agreement.
Exactly. A stalled meeting still has value for learners to understand. Stall means to delay or slow down something. In the real world, diplomacy often stalls because leaders want to maintain leverage or because the issues are too complex. For English learners, observing a stalled negotiation can teach patience and the importance of precise language. Even when nothing happens immediately, the words used and the statements made are meaningful.
The third scenario is outright failure. In this case, leaders meet but cannot find common ground at all. No ceasefire, no territorial agreements, and perhaps even public disagreement. Failure can increase tensions, but it also helps learners observe how leaders respond under pressure, the phrases they choose, the tone of speeches, and the strategies to influence public perception.
Yes, and it's important to note, Adam, that failure in diplomacy doesn't mean anyone is wrong or bad. It simply shows that international negotiations are extremely difficult. For learners, it's a chance to hear complex vocabulary and expressions like walk back on statements, leverage, and preconditions in real-world contexts. You can write them down, practice them, and see how they apply to different situations.
Finally, there's the partial agreement scenario. This is very common in international relations. Leaders might agree on some points, like humanitarian aid or a temporary ceasefire, while leaving other issues unresolved. Partial agreements are realistic and can serve as stepping stones for larger deals. They show that diplomacy often happens in stages, not in one dramatic moment.
Yes, Adam. And for our English learners, partial agreements are a useful concept. Think of them like small victories. Even if everything isn't perfect, some progress has been made. In language learning, we can relate this to learning in steps, mastering a few new words or phrases at a time, then gradually building fluency. Observing international news this way helps you connect language skills to real-world events.
Julia, this also highlights how learners can track the news safely and effectively. We recommend following simple version articles, such as news websites for beginners or watching educational news summaries. Maintaining a vocabulary journal is another great tip. Write down words or phrases like ceasefire, diplomatic breakthrough, allied solidarity, and review them regularly. Over time, you'll understand the news faster and speak about complex topics more confidently.
And Adam, it's important to add a final caution. Everything we've discussed today is educational. We are not endorsing any political view, policy, or leader. The goal is to help learners improve English while following global events. Understanding diplomacy, strategy, and negotiation vocabulary will make you a stronger reader, listener, and speaker, without taking sides.
Exactly, Julia. To sum up for our listeners, the Budapest meeting could have several outcomes: a successful meeting, a stall, outright failure, or a partial agreement. Each scenario provides real-world language learning opportunities. You can observe how leaders communicate, track vocabulary, and apply expressions in your own English practice.
Yes, Adam. Remember, learners, watch the news with curiosity, take notes on key phrases, and think critically about language. Understanding international diplomacy isn't just about politics. It's about learning how words shape action, influence decisions, and connect people across the world. Every meeting, every statement, and every negotiation is an opportunity to practice English and to understand the world better.
Well said, Julia. And with that, we conclude today's episode. Thank you to all our listeners for joining us at the English Globe. Keep learning, stay curious, and remember, language is the key to understanding both people and the planet.